The panelists that we have on right now are world-class experts in the area of cybersecurity, because as many of us already know, technology is a double-edged sword. It's changed many aspects of modern civilization, the way companies operate their business, the way people live their lives, but the convenience that comes with that technology is also a problem. As we build out the edge, we're creating a larger attack landscape and creating more critical threats to our personal security and the corporation and the government security. Before I turn it over to Joel, I'm going to share with you all just a couple quick stats. Cyber attacks on IoT devices surged 300% in 2019 to almost 2.9 billion events, according to Forbes. Hackers attack every 39 seconds, or over 2,200 times per day, according to the University of Maryland. Damage related to cybercrime is projected to hit $6 trillion annually this year. That's per Cybersecurity Ventures. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So Joel, I'll turn it over to you. Take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Ray. Yep, thank you, Ray. Am I unmuted? Okay, I think everything's good. And let me put a finer point as a lead in to the introduction to each person on the panel, and kind of provide a context that's for the audience and for the panelists. So, of all those attacks, in the year 2019, we sort of realized that more than 50% of those attacks that were successful. So we've already got a subset of the number that you said, but these are the successful attacks. That more than 50% of them gained their initial point of entry through the building systems. And in that same year, Harvard Business Review reported a study, Harvard IoT Signals reported that the number one point of entry was voice over IP phone systems, and that number two was video surveillance systems, but not the camera. It was the DVR side of the video surveillance systems, and then business systems like scanners and copiers. So notice that all of these things, to some extent, operate outside of the Ethernet band. And I like to categorize these things as non-engineered building systems. So we're not talking about building automation at this particular moment, but we'll get into building automation. But the points of entry are coming outside of building automation into, and we'll talk about where it goes in a little bit. The other thing that happened in 2019 was that NIST, which we all know well, I think, and even in the audience, as the standard bearer of cybersecurity practices. What's the standard for securing these building systems, non-engineered building systems, and other IoT? And NIST took the position that there is no standard. There can be no standard, because these devices are not manufactured and are not installed toward or within the framework of any standard. They're not interoperable with the IoT, with the IT devices that we normally think of when we talk about cybersecurity standards and cybersecurity practices. So when we look at the market, we know that the suppliers of building systems probably are going to have some role, but that role so far has not really been identified. How did they, or how are we going to enable them so that to install this and secure the systems that we purchase from them? So prior to 2019, we really were kind of in the dark on how building systems played in the situation. Following 2019, we seem to be getting closer and closer to an understanding of how to secure the IoT devices, the building systems that give way to the breaches that occur inside the Ethernet band. So I think, Ray, we're going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. And if you would, please address, if you can, either the topic of the point of entry through the IoT devices, or how do we get those devices so that they're secured with or without the participation of the suppliers. I think that'll be an interesting opening. Richard, you want to go? Richard, I can't. Anybody?
Let me try again. There you
go.
Apologies for that. So I'm Richard Hayton. I'm in the UK, as you might tell from the accent, and I work for a company that does embedded security on devices. We were spun out of Arm Electronics, and we build chip-level security. And unsurprisingly, sort of my view on this is that the view of keeping the bad guys out, well, you've got to have a boundary. If you don't have a boundary, the bad guys are already in. And if your boundary is every network socket and every Wi-Fi that you have in your building, then you've already lost. So you need to make sure that your devices are isolated from each other. And you can do that at the software layer, you can do that cryptographically, or you could do that with physical wire. But if you don't isolate things, then as soon as you plug something into a shared network, that thing has full privilege. This is what we saw happening with SolarWinds. This is what we've seen happening with the VoIP phone attacks. And it's just you've lost if that's the way you go about it. But anyway, good to meet everybody, and I'll shut up now.
Okay, John, it's good to have you here. I know it was a little dicey. I'm glad things settled down for you. Please introduce yourself and address the same two questions, if you would.
I appreciate that, Joel. Thank you. Hi, Richard and Fred. I'm John Contestabile. I've been with I've worn a number of different hats over the years. I was with Maryland Department of Transportation for a good while, and then I moved on to Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where I first got working on cyber, and now I'm with Skyline Technology Solutions. I would echo what Richard said. You have to do your best to isolate these networks, and if not totally isolate them, really manage their connection points to what other systems and networks they're talking to, with the appropriate protocols, the appropriate firewalls, the appropriate controls in place. I've promoted a view over the years of, if you imagine in your mind's eye, 3 layers: a data layer, an integration layer, and a presentation layer. And I've found that the data layer are all these systems that have varying levels of security protocols. And the presentation layer is what gets to the end user, the dashboard, the screen that they interface with. We, I think, have to build stuff. That's a highly technical term. We have to build stuff in the integration layer that manages the flow of information between those layers, controls it, puts the appropriate gates and protocols in place, isolated, as Richard said. And if you can do that, you can have a much more secure environment. And it's a combination also, as Richard said, hardware protocols as well as software and combinations thereof. So I think there are ways to do this, but we tend to buy these standalone stovepipe systems, implement them, and then we decide to connect them all up to our network, and we're amazed when we have problems. Joel, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Fred, would you do the same thing and address the issue of what takes place inside the Ethernet band and what's happening outside of the Ethernet band, and how the OT network might, participate or not participate in those two issues?
Absolutely. And thank you for letting me be a part of this panel. I mean, I always enjoy joining these panels with these guys. Fred Gordy, a little bit of quick background so you know where I'm coming from. For 10 years in my early life, I was in the IT world. And for the past 2 decades, I've been working as an integrator that installed these building systems. So in other words, a lot of the fault lies on me because we created a lot of this problem. Then for the past 7 years, my primary focus has been cybersecurity for building control systems. And I found out early on when I started trying to do this that the systems, I mean, there weren't really any standards for control systems. There was stuff for ICS and IT, but not for us. But I want to talk about what the real world looks like, because for the past 7 years, myself and my team have been doing assessments in the United States, Canada, and overseas, specifically on building control systems. And I can tell you, regardless of the country, the systems are almost identical in the way that they're configured, which means they don't have any configuration standards. So that they all boil down to three major problems: configuration management, the server management, meaning the application host, the thing that actually controls all the devices, and then backups. I want to also put it into perspective. The average commercial real estate owner, if you will, may own 100 buildings. Okay, that seems like a lot, but let's unpack that a little bit. When they have 100 buildings, they may have 300 plus contractors, okay? And they may have over 600 building control systems. That's getting kind of big, but what's even bigger than that is there could be over 2,000 network connections. And the hands that touch all of that could reach over 3,000 technicians. So you have basically each one of these buildings acting all by themselves, not following any rules and regulations, no policies, no standards. And now when you take a look at the picture that way, managing this and getting a handle on this can seem somewhat overwhelming. Well, yes, it is in one degree, but as we've shown numerous companies around the world, is you are able to do some very low-hanging fruit activities, like first find out how is your network configured, how many things are on it. Very quick story. I was doing an assessment in Australia. I was working with a well-known manufacturer, and when we got to looking at his network, he told me, he said, well, there's only 4 devices on my network. I can print that out for you. And I said, well, I flew a long way to assess this network. So that's, if you can understand, I have to do it. And he said, oh, absolutely. And he's very helpful. So I logged in, did a quick scan. There were 32 devices on that network, and he only thought there were 4. Now, you're going to say, how can that happen? Well, over years, things just get plugged in. And one of the most notable devices that was on there was a thing called a Raspberry Pi. And if you don't know what that is, it's a little project box that you can order on the web for less than $30. And anybody can sit down and learn to program in no time. The problem is anybody can learn to program this. It's very easy to get into that. And if you do a quick Google search for JPL, which is the Jet Propulsion Lab, and Raspberry Pi, you're going to see something. Now, here's a network that they truly do try to keep a handle on, or so they thought. But what they found out was somebody had plugged a Raspberry Pi in to the JPL network. And as a result, over half a gig worth of engineering drawings were taken from them. Things like SpaceX, NASA, military, all because somebody plugged in a $30 device. So with that said, when I tell people, I said, the first thing you need to do is you need to find out what you got connected. You need to find out how it's connected and if it's connected to the web, because a lot of these things are exposed publicly, which means that if I go on these search engines like Shodan or Census, I can just put in things like BACnet, which is a protocol, and boom, I've got all these BACnet devices. BACnet is an inherently open protocol, which means I can get into it without a username and password. So, to wrap it all up, if you just identify what you have and how things are set up and begin to manage the users and have access to your system, you can go a long way. So, back to you, Joel.
You know, Fred, it's Ray. I've got, I'm going to insert a comment here real quick, if you don't
Sure.
mind. And that is, you talk about building controls, you know, and I look at things from the wireless community space in that we install millions of devices at the edge all the time, whether it be AV, security cameras, antennas, remotes, things of that nature. And in a perfect world, it would all tie together, right, Fred? If you had a way to monitor, maintain, and deal with that. So whether you're a REIT or a stadium or hospitality, you have a huge disparate amount of things to manage and maintain, and it's very difficult to get your finger on all of it. And these gentlemen on this webinar can provide some guidance. Thank you.
So this kind of brings up an interesting perspective. So in the old days, the CIO was responsible for defining the perimeter. Then we got to the point where, well, hey, the perimeter is gone. Well, now, where is the perimeter? Is it the return of the perimeter, or is it the return of multiple perimeters? John, yeah, I know you can take this one.
Well, I would say it's the return of multiple perimeters. I think you certainly need firewalls at all your connections to the internet and that sort of thing, and that's kind of obvious, but it gets grayer when you're talking about building systems and you're talking about video cameras and these other kind of systems that are not typically under the CIO's umbrella. You know, we talk about IT. IT tends to revolve around enterprise systems like payroll and accounting and budgeting and forecasting and all of the business tools that a company uses. But operational technology, or OT, as we've been talking, are things like cameras and security, perimeter security systems, and copiers and voice over IP, and these are things that are not necessarily of the same ilk as what is normally under the IT banner, and so these systems tend to be run and operated by the Office of Administration or the field maintenance division or something like that, and they're not under the IT umbrella necessarily organizationally. So this poses challenges, and I think what you have to do is accept the fact that you're going to have multiple gates within the system trying to parse out who needs access to what information and what systems, and trying to really put some checkposts so that people can't move around your network freely once you're behind the one firewall, if you will. Go ahead, Richard.
Find the button. Yeah, I'll just add to that a modern network, you're quite right. A perfect world, we wouldn't need firewalls because every device would be well behaved, but we all know that's a long way from the truth. But yeah, sometimes it's physical separation, but sometimes you can do this logically. A VLAN was a concept that's been around a long time, but it isn't really a security separation. But things like VPNs, and you can get VPNs sort of in hardware boxes, which will connect point A to point B. These are great ways of isolating different systems. You should really think, if you've got a socket, if I plug something into that socket, the Raspberry Pi that I'm not supposed to have, but I probably have got, where can it go? And that's really the question you should be asking. And it should be wherever it needs to go and nowhere else. So do things like close outgoing access to the internet and see how many people scream. And lots will scream, but don't do it on an important day. But you will find the number of systems in that actually are doing illicit access. So yeah, physical separation, logical separation. And if you're building devices, then don't trust the network. From a device maker perspective, the idea is don't trust the network, assume that everyone's a bad guy, and use cryptography to check who is talking to who. If, on the other hand, you're buying devices and plugging them in, then yeah, you've got to look at things like network separation and firewalls, but also logical separations with things like VPNs as ways of separating this up. You can do physical separate wiring, great, but it's expensive. And guess what? In practice, people will avoid doing that when nobody's looking.
So, Richard, all this monitoring, detecting, preventing that you're talking about, is that all done within the Ethernet band?
I think most of it today is. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of it is. And one of the dangers is actually that monitoring itself can be a negative. So I went to a Gartner show when we went to shows a couple of years ago, and one of the points they made is if you've got something that's doing alerting for unusual behavior and it's only got an error rate of 1%, if it's generating 1,000 alerts a second, that's an awful lot of things for your team to go through, and you need a very big team to go through it. So monitoring is not a solution, but it can help you, get a handle on what's going on.
So Fred, how do we prevent the attacks from happening outside of the Ethernet band, and then being communicated to the Ethernet connector, and then being converted into Ethernet packets, and not being able to detect them as anomalies, because that's their first instance as an Ethernet packet? But yet we have all these devices around the edge that are have input ports, and they're sitting on the edge.
So
can you address that?
Yes and no. And let me explain why. I want to start with some root problems, and this is based on experience. This is what we do, and we have been collecting stats on building control system attacks. You don't see them in print that often because they don't fall under regulatory guidelines that require them to report it. So when people tell me, I never hear of anything, well, come in my world for about a month and I can show you where these things are happening. So with that said, and I think I'm going to hit a nerve with John, is people. I can tell you right now, of all the attacks that we've seen, and we've seen hundreds easy in the past 18 months, it's either been through somebody used the thing that is supposed to be controlling the entire building as a place to check their social media, check their email, and guess what? They got ransomware released on the thing that's supposed to be controlling their building. Now, you're in a situation. You either have to pay the ransom, or if you have a good backup strategy, no problem, right? Well, these guys are not backing these systems up. They might back them up once a year. They might back them up. The vendor comes in and, let me make a copy. Very quick story. A guy, there was one company got hit, and it took them 92 days to get fully recovered. And what had happened was the guy clicked an email that he thought was from his buddy in the same department. And when he clicked the link, it didn't go anywhere. And he said, that was weird. And so he said, he thought maybe I should make a backup. So he made a backup right then. His buddy walks through. He says, hey, man, that link you sent me didn't go anywhere. And the guy said, I didn't send you a link. And so, okay. Later on, they got locked up. Ransomware. They said, we're okay. So they got the backup, got the vendor in there, got it reinstalled. The next day when they came in, they noticed controllers were offline. They noticed that the building was hot, and they started looking around. And what had happened is somebody had overridden the safeties on the VFDs, the variable frequency drive, the thing that drives the water through the pumps, created cavitation. What cavitation does is just basically bang the pumps around and create pits in them. And so what they ended up having to do, what they figured out was, because they didn't pay the ransom, the backup still had infection in it. They put in a remote access Trojan, which allowed the bad guys to come in. And then they were pissed off, so they beat up the equipment. They had to tear the chillers down to make sure they were okay. But it took them 92 days to get recovery. And it all came from clicking an email. So I'm not saying we shouldn't address what you say, Joel, but we've got an education process that's got to happen with the people. John, I know you got something to say about that for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to add the rubric that I use quite a bit is people, process, and technology. And it's a good one to keep in the back of your head, because we as technologists, we come to these problems with a technical orientation, but the reality is the technology is usually the least of our problem. You can find a patch or a method, a methodology, or a software or a box that'll do what you want it to do technologically, but the people in the process is a bit of the Wild West. And when I say that, people go, "What do you mean by people?" Well, I mean matters of trust. Does person A trust person B? Does vendor A trust vendor B? Matters of communication. Is there good communication amongst the people? Competency. Are the people competent? Have we trained them? Training is a people issue as well. So there's a whole host of issues around people that if you don't get that right, the technology won't matter. But then there's the whole process piece. You have protocols, standard operating procedures. We're going to back up every night. We're going to back up once a week. Have you exercised? Have you run drills where you actually have to restore from those backups and actually implement that? I mean, you need procedures and policies and standard operating procedures that enact what your IT posture should be, and we find those lacking all the time. So it's really, you need success across. It's like a three-legged stool. You need success across all three of those. And if you look at some of the cyber assessment tools that are out there now, they try to touch on this soft side, if you will, that isn't just strictly about hardware and software and firewalls and the like. So yeah, that's near and dear to my heart, Fred.
Gentlemen, I was just informed by Alyssa that we have another 10 minutes.
I got it right. Okay. So I have some people for you to consider. I'd like you folks to consider here. The people who install these systems, do they have an obligation, and is there a way that these people can be prepared to install systems that are either hardened, because they probably can't secure them, but they can harden them? And anybody who wants to take on the topic of hardening and securing and make the, distinguish the two, you're welcome to do it. Raise your hand. Anybody?
I don't know if I'm gonna. Let's all have a go. Let me just make one point about the people side. It's a really important point. People will come into your building to install things that you have less control over. People have the right, they believe, to Facebook, to social media, to network access, to Wi-Fi. Give it to them. If you don't give it to them, they will find a way, and they will be running Facebook on your servers. They will be plugging in their laptops to your network ports in your lockdown data centers, and they will be doing bad things. So public Wi-Fi that is isolated from everything that matters is actually a great thing you can do to improve security. On the hardening versus security thing, let me talk a little bit about securing. I work with people who secure devices. We work primarily in the mobile phone space, and there is a lot of very good work that goes on in mobile phones. It's a very deep industry. We also work in automotive, and again, it's great. It's very mature. Most of IoT, most, not all, but most is just starting out in terms of security. It's not good. So yes, we should encourage vendors to secure their devices better, but the reality is we shouldn't expect them to be good at it. It's going to take them a few years to learn. And
now, are we asking them to harden or secure? And what's the difference?
We should be asking them to do both.
Let me throw it out there. I'll throw it out there. So security is done within a risk profile. Security is managing risk. Hardening is putting some security controls in place without really knowing what the specific risks are in the particular situation, but it prepares the device to be secured. It's a preparatory step. And the building system, go ahead.
No, I agree. I think there are there's lots of different people who are improving things, and some are taking one stance or the other. So right from the bottom, the chip makers, ARM has been talking an awful lot about security. It's almost every word they talk about as a chip vendor, but they're not enough. They're just one player. When it comes in at the higher level, often it's from the industry specifics. They don't know what the threat is. They talk more about hardening. So yeah, it's a complicated space that's really just getting started. But it's
right.
And Joel,
John, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
John, you want to do it, then you, Fred, okay? First John,
Okay.
then Fred.
Well, I wanted to say, you've posited the question as kind of an either or, harden or secure, and I think it's kind of both. Meaning, and what I was my mind already went to is as a building owner or an owner and operator, when you put out a procurement, there should be questions in your procurement about how do you harden your system and how do you secure your system. And so that should be one of the evaluation points when you're evaluating vendors who are going to come in. I always used to say that, you get as much cybersecurity as you're willing to specify in your procurements and you're willing to pay for, and because it doesn't come free. So we are not savvy enough in a lot of the procurements we do and the vendors we select by asking the right questions during that phase, I would say. Go ahead, Fred.
I agree. Fred?
So, Joe, you said something a minute ago, and I thought it was really key, and it also kind of answered the question. They can only harden a manufacturer can only harden something up to what they know their product can withstand. And with that said, in my opinion, and I think a lot of other people's opinion, cybersecurity falls on everybody's shoulder. That's the manufacturer has a responsibility to do the due diligence because they are the expert in their product. The installer has to do the best practices because they are the experts in their product. And then the end user is responsible for the people that interact with that product. And at any time you get a hole in that chain, you're going to have a availability of somebody to get in there. So
good response, Fred. I appreciate that. Really good. Richard?
Can I just?
I wanted
to go right back to the example, Joel, that you made at the beginning. And this is why security is not just something you say, I want £3 of that, please. You need to understand what you're after. Let's talk about VoIP phones again for a moment. A feature of a VoIP phone may be the ability to listen in. So I can say, I want to use that VoIP phone as a microphone so I can listen in to what's happening in that meeting. Now, in the right circumstance, that's a great feature that I want to use for useful things. But maybe it's being used to spy on my boardroom. Maybe it's a really bad thing. It's not, is it secure or insecure? That's about configuration. It's about what did you want to use this product to do? And importantly, did you even know that feature existed? Because if the installer didn't know the feature existed, they probably didn't turn it off when they should have done. So there are some great things. There's some great concepts like secure by default, which means the product should turn off any feature which should be a security threat by default. So the installer can turn it on if they actually want it. They're great things to look for. And it's a great coverall when you're specifying a product to say, do you have a secure development lifecycle? Is your product secure by default? And importantly, updates. We know that updating things can cause huge problems, but equally, if no updates are available and you find that it's got some software stack that was written in the 1970s that everybody and his dog knows has got a vulnerability, you're in major trouble. So knowing that your product can be updated and then that you can make that update work within your schedule so that it happens at an appropriate time, that's really important.
Joel?
What's going off? Okay, wait. So we talked about people and we talked about processes. What would we say about the role of different people, different categories of people in the process? So if you think about the role of the vendor, the building supplier, system supplier, the privileged users, other users, who runs the show? Where does the leadership come from that understands the technology, the company, and the processes?
I like to say cybersecurity is everybody's problem, therefore it's nobody's problem, and that's part of the issue. I think it does require it's a cross-organizational, cross-functional responsibility that requires some sort of governance structure beyond just the CIO. Is my
okay. Now, I would suggest it's not governance because we're evolving too much. We're not mature enough, but it does require some executive level oversight, leadership.
No, yeah, no.
It's a bunch of people playing on a field, and some are playing different games. True?
Yeah, no, we're on the same page. When I say governance, it really needs to be all levels of the organization. Certainly, you need executive sponsorship and executive muscle behind it, and you need the budgeting that comes from the executives making it a priority. But you also need the person at the bottom of the food chain who's going to click on that link and to be understanding of what they're doing. You need to have the training in place for them. So that's what I mean. It's cross-functional, cross-department, and you don't have structures that support that typically. So you really need to create some sort of structure that drives it through the whole organization.
Yep. So since we're almost done, we've got a kind of a yes, no, and maybe a comment response. So would you say that with the proper leadership that we'd have a better chance at securing the systems? And who would do that, and where'd that come from, and what do you look for? Where do you look for that to come from?
Well, I think it starts at the top. I mean, management has to say cybersecurity is a priority, and they have to allocate sufficient funding for it. But if you follow the people, process, technology rubric, they need to look across all three of those. What are we doing for our people? Are we training them on this? What are we doing for our IT competency and our IT staff? Do we have the right people? They even need to look at organizational structures. Do we have a red team that we support, that we keep? Is that team separate from the IT, department that can be somewhat independent? I mean, so you have to look at the people issues. You have to look at the process issues. What do we do when we have an attack? How do we detect it? How quickly do we respond? And the technology, Richard said and Fred said that there are tools and capabilities out there that you can employ, but only if done in an orchestrated manner that makes sense. As Richard says, what do you want it to do? Do we understand that fundamentally?
Is it IT, or is it facilities, or is it a combination?
Yeah,
and then Ray, I got you.
Yeah,
no problem. I just wanted to echo what John just said and add to it real quick. It's embedded into the fabric of the culture of the government agency or enterprise organization, and it extends beyond that organization to the OEMs that they choose to work with, the VARs and the integrators that are within their ecosystem. And if you have all of that stitched together, you got a better chance. Thank you.
Quick opinion: nobody's exempt from cybersecurity.
Okay.
I agree with all of you.
I think that sums it up right there. Ray, are we out of time?
We are just about out of time here. Man, you guys were great. Listen, no one is exempt from that, and it's becoming more and more of an issue, no doubt, particularly as more businesses adopt a digital transformation commitment, right? That is, affecting every department everywhere, and having fortified, points within that infrastructure is important. One of the questions I had, if you guys don't mind, is zero trust initiatives. Is that something that's viable? Is that one of the ways that, will help shore up security, or is it just another buzzword?
No, I'd say it's got a lot going for it, but it's not going to solve everything unless everything can have zero trust. So zero trust is about saying, device A that's talking to device B or server B, they're going to identify each other and they're going to trust each other regardless of what's connecting them. So regardless of who might be between. It's a great model, but it only works for things which are built on that way of working. So most of the systems we're talking about weren't built with that in mind. Maybe they will be one day, but in the meantime, yes, use it where you can, but it's only one of the tools in your toolkit.
And everybody's looking for the magic silver bullet, and zero trust is a very effective tool, but it's not the end all be all. I mean, nothing is. If somebody knows where that end all be all is, let me know, because I hadn't found it.
Yeah.
We'd all be very wealthy by now.
Well, that'll be at our in-person meeting. You guys will share the end all be all. You guys were all great. Thank you so much for being here. And Ray, thank you for bringing all your friends and peers. Thank you.